So today what we're going to be doing, guys, is we're going to be going through 7C. And 7C is the last spread for chapter 7. So that'll finish the first half of the social psychology chapters in this unit for us. So in spread C, what we're doing is we're just going to further understand human behavior, further understand how we make judgments about people through this concept called attribution. Okay, so attribution is this idea that we explain people's behavior by attributing a reason to it. Okay, so basically when someone behaves the way that they do, we try to justify that behavior. Okay, so we try to make reasons for that behavior. We try to think of what are the sources that could exist for them to behave in the way that they do. So that can be for other people's behavior, but it can even be for our own behavior. So for example, if you come late to school, the reason you give for coming late to school is how you attribute your behavior to a particular reason. Okay, so attribution is basically how we explain the causes. It's how we explain the why of why we've come late to school, or why we've done something, or why we behave the way that we behave. Okay, so that's attribution, the definition that we need to know. Now, attribution is a cognitive process, which means that there's a lot of thinking, a lot of reasoning, a lot of decision making involved when we attribute a reason to someone's behavior. And a lot of attribution involves three processes. So first of all, there's the process of observation, and that's when we observe something. Okay, we see something happening in our environment, because we can't just make up reasons for someone's behavior without first observing some behavior that they've done. So that is the observation part. So for example, you observe someone kicking a chair. Okay, that's the observation. You then determine that what the behavior is. Okay, remember, not everything you see is exactly what it is. But if you've observed someone kicking a chair, you've seen it with your own eyes, you're able to confirm and determine and affirm that the behavior was that the person kicked the chair. It's not just a rumor. It's not just something that someone's told you. You saw it with your own eyes. So that's when you've determined the behavior as being accurate, as being correct, and you've confirmed that. The attribution is then when you try to think of reasons as to why that person might have kicked that chair. Okay, so you might think, okay, maybe the person kicked the chair because they're angry or they're a violent person. Okay, or alternatively, you might think that maybe the person kicked the chair because it wasn't stable. It wasn't like, whenever they sat on it, it was a bit wobbly and they were annoyed by it. Okay, so you think of some reason as to why that person would have kicked that chair. That's what attribution is. It's basically thinking of the cause or the reasons for a person's behavior that you have observed in real life. Okay, so that's basically what attribution is. Those are the three cognitive processes in attribution. So that's basically what you really need to know in terms of cognitive processes, or the three steps that are involved. Okay, and you need to be able to apply or link these three steps, so observation, determining behavior, and attribution, to any scenario that we give you, or you should be able to unpack the scenario and divide it into these three steps as well. Okay, that's the cognitive processes involved. If we go to the next slide, we're going to learn about two types of attributions that all of us make, that everyone around us we know will make in terms of behavior. These two attributions are called internal attributions and external attributions. An internal attribution is basically when we explain behavior in terms of the person involved, in terms of their personality, in terms of their individual characteristics that make them who they are. Okay, so characteristics means personality. It means a person's personality, a person's qualities, okay, a person's traits. So these are basically to do with the individual. And that's why this picture on this slide kind of highlights or puts a little spotlight on this person as an individual, because that's what internal attributions are. You're kind of attributing a person's behavior to themselves. So example, there's so many things that make each of us different from one another, but our personality is one of them, our traits is another, our ability to do things or our capacity to do things is another thing, our attitude, our motivation, our mood, even our individual personal effort. Okay, all of those things are related to internal attributions, or who we are. So if we're talking about a few examples here, if we talk about this idea that she tripped because she's clumsy. Tripping is the behavior here, and she's clumsy is the internal attribution that we make to explain that behavior of why she tripped. Okay, she tripped because she, as a person, individually, as an internal characteristic, is clumsy. Okay, similarly, the next example is she got the highest mark. So that's again a behavior or something that we can observe. Okay, she got the highest mark because she's smart. Okay, she's smart. That's again an individual personality trait or a characteristic there. Okay, or an adjective that we might use to describe an individual as being different from another person. Similarly, he's good at basketball because he's tall. Again, kind of a stereotype, but he's good at basketball. So being good at basketball, again, is something we can observe. Okay, he's tall. That's an individual individual physical characteristic, okay, which basically influences this guy's ability to do things. So internal attributions are all about that individual person and who they are. It can be their personality, it can be their physical characteristics. But in other words, internal attributions are basically to do with the person. So we're linking that person's behavior to who they are rather than the world around them. Okay. And for this reason, and in the old textbook and some of your other resources, you might have internal attributions are the same thing or are also called personal attributions. Okay. So personal attributions, if you see that terminology used anywhere, that is the same thing as an internal attribution. Okay. In some online websites, in some websites online, internal attributions are also called dispositional. Okay, so if you see the word dispositional attribution, that is also the same thing as an internal attribution or a personal attribution. Now, obviously, you've got all these terms, but in the actual SAC or in the actual assessment, we'll only be using this term, internal attributions. Okay, we won't ask you a question with this in it just because it's not the main term that's used in your textbook. So we want to be really consistent with the Ed Rollo textbook. So yeah, internal attributions is the term we'll be referring to. All right, so hopefully that makes sense about an internal attribution. So what we're going to do now is I'm going to put an example in the chat box, an example of a behavior, and I want you guys to think of any internal attribution that you can give, so any internal reason that you could provide or justify for that person doing that behavior. So I'm going to put that in the chat box now, just so we can see that we've all understood the internal attributions. So okay, so the example is Lisa did poorly in her psychology SAC. So that's just behavior, something that we can observe. Okay, we can observe that by seeing Lisa's reaction when she gets her mark, maybe by seeing the way the teacher responds to Lisa's mark. Okay, so I want you guys to give me now one internal attribution, just something related to Lisa as a person that might explain that behavior. It can be anything, any answer. It just has to relate to an internal characteristic or personality trait there. Yep, so we've got a few answers coming up. I'll just read some of them. So because she didn't study, yep, that's on her, exactly. She's slow in learning, yep, that's another reason. Because she's lazy, yeah, she lacks the motivation. Yeah, those are good answers there, yeah. So because she's lazy, she didn't study, good. Excellent. Okay, so you can see here in all of these answers, what we're doing is we're actually kind of blaming the person, or we're putting it on them, okay, that your behavior is because of you, okay? Let me give you guys another example and then we'll move on. So what can we say? Let's do a different example now. Okay, so the next example is Tom was unable to achieve the final goal for his team to win the game. So think about an internal attribution we might make there in terms of characteristics of the person involved. So characteristics of Tom involved. Yeah, that's a good one. So he might have become unfit. Yeah, maybe he wasn't training as much in the days leading up to the game. He wasn't focused. Yep. So he was a bit distracted during the game. He wasn't his usual self. He had a lack of self-confidence. Yeah, excellent. He was nervous. Yep. A lot of the time when you've got pressure to make the final goal, you can be obviously nervous or anxious. He got tired or fatigued during the game. Excellent. So there's some really good answers there. Yeah. So guys, this is basically what you need to be able to identify, like when it comes to internal attribution. So if we give you a behavior, you need to be able to provide a reason for that. Okay, so I think you guys have a good understanding of internal attribution. So I think we'll move on to the next type of attribution, which is external attribution. Now, an external attribution is literally the opposite. Okay, an external attribution is when we explain behavior in terms of an outside factor, not the person themselves, we don't put the blame on them, but rather we put it on the outside environment or the outside society or the outside community, the outside culture, any kind of outside factor that isn't just the individual themselves. Okay, so if we look at this little rainbow looking diagram here, which as you can see, I cropped out very unneatly from another picture. If this is the person, it looks like a spider. Okay, hold on. I'm trying to get to it looking like a person. Okay, if that's the person, the external attributions relate to all the factors that are around that person. Okay, so all the factors that that person is surrounded by. It doesn't just have to be the environment. It can even be culture. It can even be the kind of living conditions, whether the person is employed. It could be the economy. Okay, it could be their family, their friends. All of these things make up or relate to a person's external attribution. So again, external attribution is due to the actions of some other person, not yourself. If it was yourself, it would be internal. It can be your society, it could be your culture, it could be your environment around you, it could be the task itself. Okay, so maybe the soccer game was just really challenging. Maybe the weather was not good, and that's why Tom wasn't able to score the goal. Okay, could be luck, or it could even be fate. Okay, or destiny. So those are what external attributions are. Okay, and when we do a behavior or when we engage in an action and we make an external attribution for that action, we're basically trying to project that action's reasoning onto an outside factor. Okay, we're not trying to take the credit for ourselves. Okay, and you'll notice that people who are quite humble in nature, people who don't like to make a big show of themselves, tend to use external attributions a lot. Okay, and as we're going to learn towards the end of today, you'll also realize that people from countries where humility and is valued and where boastfulness is not valued actually also use external attributions a lot. So you'll see that in the first example here. I passed the driving test, which is obviously a behavior, because the licensing officer was a nice guy. Okay, so you're not really attributing that behavior to you being a skilled driver or all that 120, 130 hours of practice you did, but rather that your licensing officer was a nice guy. Okay, I failed the SAC because the teacher didn't teach us properly. So the teacher in this case is not you, it's an outside factor, it's an outside person. I was late to school, and this is a common one, probably an accurate one, but still a common one. I was late to school because there was traffic. Okay, so traffic again is an outside factor there. You're not blaming it on yourself. Okay, and very rarely do we attribute an internal. So very rarely do we actually say an internal attribution for coming late to school, unless you really own up to that fact. You wouldn't say I'm late to school because I slept in. Okay, some students do actually. I have experienced that, but a lot of people would obviously blame the traffic, especially if that is what was the main reason. Okay, so external attributions are often related to what situation you're in, and for that reason they're also called situational attributions. Okay, so that's what an external attribution is. So I'm going to give you guys one example in the chat box now, and I want you guys to think of an external attribution for this example. So what can we say? Let's make this one about me. Okay, Miss Farine came 5 minutes late to class. So what do you guys think? Think about the external attributions that could have occurred here. So outside factors that could have influenced this behavior from me. Miss B wanted to talk to her. Yes, it happens. That's a good one. My laptop was malfunctioning. Yeah. A kid fell on the way and she had to call the ambulance. Wow, thanks. You're making me the hero in this scenario because her car broke down. Yeah, it can happen because, yeah, a lot of the time I have you guys in period 1 as well. So, yeah, that's definitely a good example. There were a lot of people in the hallway. Yeah, it does happen, especially if you're walking from the other side, from the other building. Traffic, yeah, could have happened as well. Yeah, so these are all external attributions. Other external attributions I can probably suggest are things like I was photocopying a bunch of booklets and it was taking too long. That's often a common reason. What else? Maybe I was finishing off my coffee. Yeah, no, I would usually chuck my coffee. I wouldn't make that cause me to be late to class. But yeah, it's usually photocopying. That is the main reason. But good external attributions. So yeah, that's what an external attribution is. Okay, any outside factor there. Okay, so then we're looking at an example here. So if we've got internal versus external attributions, and we're trying to relate it back to real life. So if you let a friend borrow your car for a trip and they got into a crash, an external attribution would look something like this. So the person who's let their friend borrow the car might say, oh, you know what? Okay, it's unfortunate, but you might have crashed because of how rainy it was, and my tires are pretty old as well. So rather than blaming his friend, he's blaming the state of his car and the fact that his car wasn't really well maintained to begin with. Okay, that's an external attribution. You're not blaming the person, but rather you're blaming the situation or the environment or the car itself. An internal attribution would look something like this. This only happened because you're such a reckless driver, or, you know, you idiot, how could you do this? I knew that you were always such a risk taker, blah, blah, blah. So you're really blaming that person, and you're using a lot of like negative adjectives there to describe that person, okay, and to attribute the car crash to that person's personality traits of being a risk taker, or that person's tendencies to be reckless when it comes to driving or to take risks like speeding. Okay, so that's an internal attribution. Internal attribution is when you're focusing on the person and you're blaming them. External is when you're blaming the state of the car, like the state of the tires being a little bit worn out, or maybe the rain that falls from the sky or whatever. Okay, all of that kind of stuff. Okay, so that's basically an example of an internal versus an external attribution there. Okay, and again, this is just the diagram from your book so that you've got it. External attribution, you're thinking about the world at large and the situation, whereas in an internal attribution, you're focusing on the person involved. Okay, this is a quick activity. So there's it's the same scenario. Yeah, same observation, same behavior, but I want you guys to think of 2 attributions here. So we'll just read through it together. So the observation is you're at the supermarket, you see a mother yelling at their child in the supermarket to be quiet. So that's the same scenario for both. And obviously, when you see her yelling at her child to be quiet, you identify and you confirm that, yes, the behavior is the mother yelling at the child. So now I want you guys to think of one internal attribution that you can relate the mother's yelling to, and an external attribution that you can relate the mother's yelling to. So just put your answers in the chat box. And remember, you can have a multiple number of answers for this question. So anything that you think might be the reason there, internally and externally. And then I'll also do a sample answer once we get a few in the chat box. And also when you write your answer, just specify which one it is. So write internal answer or external answer so that we know which one is which. Yep, so internal could be the mother's frustration, and external could be that the child is too loud or that the child wants something. Excellent. Yeah, that's a good answer. Internal, the mother is angry. Maybe she has anger issues. Yeah, excellent. Okay, external. Yeah, the kid is stealing lollies and being dumb. Yep, that can be an external one. So internal, she's frustrated. Yep. 2, her child won't shut up. Yep, that's an external. External, he slipped from water on the floor and knocked a shelf over. Yep, that is an external one. Internal, she's a strict parent. Yep. And external, she is facing a lot of stress from work. Yeah. So that can be an external factor to explain her behavior. Yeah. So that's good. So those are some good examples there. So yeah, again, internal attribution can be anything. You could talk about maybe the mother's. This is where we blame the mother, or we put all the focus on her, okay, as a mother. So we might attribute the mother's yelling to, her having a lot of, issues with controlling her anger. Okay, this is the initial judgment that a person might make. Or we might think that she's not a good parent, okay, that she doesn't know how to discipline her kid. Those are individual attributions we make about that mother, okay? However, an external attribution could be, like some of the things you guys mentioned. Maybe she's going through a lot of stress at home. Okay, maybe she is trying to go shopping, but she's also juggling like a full-time job or a part-time job there. Maybe she already gave the kid what they wanted, but now they want something else. So it's like an external factor, something that she doesn't have a lot of control over there. Okay, so those are some good answers there. So that's basically showing you how we can have the same situation, the same observation, same behavior, but the attributions that two people make or the reasoning that people give for that behavior can be different. Okay, so attribution is obviously a really big part of how we make social judgments and how we even interact with others in our environment. Obviously, if we can justify that a person has a reason for their behavior, a good reason, we often excuse them. So in this scenario, for example, the one we just looked at, if we can understand, or if the mother says, oh my God, I've been working every day this week and this kid just won't let me live, people that are passing by might be a little bit more sympathetic towards her. But if we don't know that information, and if there's nothing in that scenario or environment that tells us that that is the situation that she's going through, we might just pass her off, or even think badly of her as being not a good parent or not knowing how to discipline her child in public. Okay, and this is basically an internal attribution that we're making. And a lot of the time, we might not be sympathetic towards her in such a situation. So like I said, attribution can affect your future actions, okay? It can affect your actions as an individual person, and it can also affect your behavior too towards other people. So if we talk about, for example, people's attitudes and attributions that people make towards those who are disabled, who have medical conditions, or who, for example, which is a really common issue now in Australia, are obese. Okay, obesity is a medical issue. But if we make an internal attribution that, okay, this person is the weight that they are because of their own laziness, because of the fact that they can't stay away from fast food, because of the fact that they don't exercise or they can't get off the couch, what we're doing is we're making an internal attribution about the person. And in doing that, you're actually forming a kind of almost like a prejudice towards that person or that group of people. Okay. And you might actually not feel sympathetic towards these kinds of people if you make that internal attribution. Okay. However, if you were to make an external attribution, and if you were to think, okay, this person is obese, but it's probably due to a medical issue. Okay, it's probably due to a handicap or a disability. We know people who are bound to wheelchairs, for example, eventually get obese because they cannot actually, move around as much as they could before. Okay, we know that increases the chances. If you can understand that a person who's obese or is the way that they are because of an underlying medical or health issue, you might not judge them as negatively as if you just thought it was due to their plain old laziness. Okay, and you might be more sympathetic and more helpful towards such a person in public if you were to understand that behavior or that phenomena through an external attribution rather than an internal one. Okay, because remember, when we use internal attributions, not just for this example, but for any example, we put the blame on that person rather than trying to understand the kind of limitations or the kind of restrictions or the kind of situations they're working within or trying their best to overcome. Okay, now the repeated pattern or the tendency to choose a specific type of attribution is called an attributional style. Okay, you might not consciously realize this, but all of us actually tend to use some attributions more than others. And we're going to learn about some of the more common ones we use in the next few slides. But some people use internal attributions more. So whatever behavior they see, they're like, it's on that person. It's up to them. They could have changed it. They could have done something. Okay. Whereas others might be like, no, we have to consider the issue. We have to consider that maybe it's the home environment. Okay. Maybe it's, maybe it's their friends, maybe it's their family. We can't just look at only that person by themselves. Okay, so the kind of attributional style you use, whether you use more internal attribution or more external attribution, is called attributional style. Okay, the pattern of attribution that you tend to use when judging a person's behavior. Okay, so the next thing that we're looking at now is just an example again from your book. I'm not going to go through this too much, but it just shows you the differences. When you fail a test or fail a SAC and you make an internal attribution saying, I didn't study hard enough for that test, it's my fault, you have more control over that behavior because it's up to you now. The same way that the blame was on you, it's also up to you to change it. So you're more likely to study harder for the next test and perhaps even perform better on the next test. When we're talking about behaviors like failing a test or SAC, and then you make an external attribution, you say that test was unfair, or the teacher was a harsh marker, or I didn't do well because it was on EP. Those are external attributions that you make. And a lot of the time, there's no I in the external attribution, okay? There's no I as in you don't have control and you don't feel like you have control here. And so for that reason, you might not be able to do better on the next test because you don't feel you have the capability or opportunity there to control that situation. Here, you feel like you have control because the I is there, okay? You have control over that situation, but here you don't. So that's the difference between when you make an internal attribution and when you make an external attribution, and how that can influence your future behavior. Generally, when we try to make internal attributions for some examples or some behaviors, we feel like we might have more control over that behavior. Okay, so that is the main difference between the two. So basically, yeah, that's the same thing from the previous slide. So just going through, the SAC example. So this slide literally explains this slide a little bit more. Okay, and when we talk about internal locus of control, external locus of control, don't stress about the word locus of control. I've just taken this picture from the internet. Just look at it as an internal attribution and an external attribution, okay, and the reasonings for why a person got a bad grade or a good grade. All right, so that's basically showing you how your attribution will influence your future action or future behavior there. Okay, so now we're going to look at some factors that affect attribution. Our attributions are not 100% accurate all the time, okay? And just like we're biased in everything else, we are also biased in the way that we make attributions. A most common example of a bias is when we tend to focus on bad things and kind of ignore the good things, okay? That is an example of a bias. Attribution bias is a type of cognitive bias or a faulty way of thinking in which we incorrectly or irrationally think or make faulty decisions related to the reasons behind someone else's behavior. In other words, we misconstrue or we misunderstand why a person behaves the way that they behave. We incorrectly assume or make assumptions about why the person does what they do, and that might lead to us making unfair judgments or unwarranted judgments about the person that they just don't deserve. Okay, so we might victim blame, or we might actually, make an incorrect assumption there about why they're doing what they're doing. Okay, so the types of attribution bias are can be remembered using the memory tip FADS. So F for fundamental attribution error, A for actor observer bias, D for defensive attribution, and S for self-serving bias. So these are the 4 types of bias, and that'll finish up the spread fast. Okay, so that's the 4 types of bias we're going to look at now. The first one is the fundamental attribution error. Now, the fundamental attribution error is this idea that we tend to overestimate the influence of internal factors and underestimate the impact of external factors or external attributions when it comes to people's behavior. So in other words, in the fundamental attribution error, what we're doing is, so fundamental attribution error is that we are making more internal attributions, or we're more internally attributing behavior to an actual person. Can't write on this thing, internal compared to external. Okay, and when we do that, what we're really doing is we're putting more of a blame on the person or attributing that behavior to the individual characteristics, to the people involved, rather than to the situations they might be going through. Okay, and we use the fundamental attribution error, or we make the fundamental attribution error mostly for negative behaviors or negative events. Okay, which basically means that we are crap people because we only judge someone's internal characteristics or personality when they do something bad or when they stuff up. But when they do something good, the fundamental attribution error doesn't really apply. Okay, so we don't really give people the credit for their successes, but we give them credit when they are doing something negative. And that's when we put all the internal attributions on them. Okay, so an own person's behavior, okay, and we are focusing on the internal. That's why they're the same color there. Okay, so the example here with the picture of the man and his pregnant wife, okay, if a man overtakes you on the road, even though it's risky, there's barely enough space to overtake, and then you continue to see him speeding down the road, you might start to have a little bit of road rage, but you also might attribute his behavior to him being, not his nose, him being a responsible person, okay, being an irresponsible driver, I mean, and that's an internal attribution, because what you're doing is you are putting that behavior on him as an irresponsible driver, as an inconsiderate human being, rather than considering that the situation might be to blame, rather than considering that maybe his pregnant wife is in the back seat and she needs to be rushed to hospital because she's going to go into labor soon and her water's broke or something like that. Okay, so fundamental attribution error, that's one example. Okay, any example where you're blaming the person more than the situation is can be considered a fundamental attribution error. Okay, if a student, for example, is constantly late to Zoom class, and I only think about how they're so irresponsible or they're so, disorganized or whatever, and I don't focus on the fact that, okay, maybe they've got a lot of siblings to care for at home, or maybe they were on the other side of the house, or maybe their laptop charger was, somewhere else and they couldn't find it. If I only focus on them being irresponsible, but don't consider the situational factors they're working with at home, which is obviously a different environment to school, then I am making the fundamental attribution error. Okay, anytime you put all the focus on the person and you put the behavior on them, rather than thinking about the situation, you are making the fundamental attribution error. So remember, fundamental attribution error, internal attributions are emphasized more heavily than the external for any behavior. Okay, and that the fundamental attribution error applies more for negative behaviors and events, like someone cutting you off on the road or someone coming late to class, which are considered or seen by most people as negative or not positive events there. Okay, so the next thing that we're looking at is just an example. So this is a lady, okay, why is Laura late? So if she's making an internal attribution here, she might blame Laura's personality. She's unreliable as a person. If she's making an external attribution here, she might say, okay, maybe there was a big traffic jam. Maybe her daughter is sick. Okay, maybe she's at home because she's sick herself. Okay, you're thinking about the situation there. Okay. No, sorry, not maybe because she's sick herself. So is her daughter sick? Maybe her husband's sick. Maybe she, maybe she's got people from overseas at home and it's really hectic. Okay, any external factor there. The fundamental attribution error is when this boss or this employer ignores the influence of the situation. So basically says, stuff all of that. I don't care about that. And she only focuses on Laura as a person. So Laura's late because she's unreliable, because she's disorganized, because she's, not dedicated to her work. So she's really, really ignoring the influence of the situation and attributing the actions that Laura has done from being late to work on her character or her personality. Okay. So that's the fundamental attribution error there. The next one is the actor-observer bias. Now, the actor-observer bias is this idea that we are the observer. So I am the observer or you are the observer, and other people around us are the actors in our environment or in our world. Okay. And basically, actor-observer bias refers to this tendency or this habit of us to attribute our own negative behavior to external or situational causes, but attribute others' negative behavior, so the actors in our world or the other people's negative behavior, to internal or personal factors. Again, showing why humans can be such crap people, because what this actually means is that when we do something negative, we blame the environment, but when someone else does something negative, we blame them. That's the basic idea in actor-observer bias. So for example, with this situation here about littering, when someone else litters, you might be like, oh my God, people are so inconsiderate, like, save the environment, blah, blah, blah. But when you yourself litter, you're like, there wasn't really, rubbish being close by, or I can't just hold this, my hand will get sticky. So you like, you start to blame other things, but you don't really blame yourself. Okay, that's the actor-observer bias. So in other words, it's summarized here from this table in your book. The negative behavior for yourself is due to outside circumstances, is due to luck, is due to the situation. But when the negative behavior is done by another person, it's always due to personal factors, like them being a crappy person or having a crappy personality there. Okay, so that's the actor-observer bias. Defensive attribution is this idea that it's a little bit different from the rest, because defensive attribution is kind of a way that we protect our own feelings. And defensive attributions occur when we learn of another person who's going through a hardship or difficulty in their life. And we try to attribute that crisis or hardship to them as a person, to an internal factor or reason that they could have controlled to get themselves out of that situation. I'll give you an example really soon, but defensive attributions are basically done because we try to defend or protect or safeguard ourselves from this idea that the same traumatic, scary, difficult, hardship kind of thing could have happened to us as well. So we try to protect ourselves from that scary thought, because look, we live in a scary world. All these kinds of scary things happen. Okay, defensive attributions are basically this idea that if I was in that situation, I wouldn't have been out so late at night. I wouldn't have got drunk. I wouldn't have, gone home with a person I've never known before. Okay, and thus I wouldn't have been murdered as a result of that, or something like that. So I don't know if you guys remember, this was a pretty big case in the news when it first came out in 2012 about Jill Maher. So Jill Maher was actually I think she was an Irish woman or something. She was living in Melbourne with her husband. I think their house was like in Brunswick or something. And I think one night after work, after a work party or something, I think it was after midnight, she was actually walking down Sydney Road in Brunswick, as we all know. And as she was walking down, I think some guy started following her, and then like stalked her, obviously, and then she was raped and murdered. And her body was later found in Gisborne, in regional Victoria. So it was a big case on the news. And when it first came out, a lot of people, especially in the social media comments, were making all kinds of comments like, kind of blaming her. And what happens with defensive attributions is we often do blame the victim. Okay, so rather than, and this is the CCTV footage here showing her walking down the street. Okay, and when you watch the full CCTV footage, you can actually see the guy kind of following her a few minutes after. Anyway, so when this first came out, a lot of people were like, oh, why was she out around 1:30 to 2 a.m., as you can see on her missing poster there? Why was she out that late? Like, if I was her, I would have never been out that late, particularly, being a woman and knowing the society that we live in, knowing the world we live in. And then people were even like, blaming her like about like her heels, like why would she wear heels, she can barely run in there, maybe if she wore normal shoes like she would have gotten away, blah blah blah. And in a way, you can probably say that all of those things that people comment are actually defensive attributions, because you're trying to protect yourself from this idea that such a scary thing happened so close to home in Brunswick that it could happen to you. But you try to distance yourself away from the idea that it could have happened to you, because you focus on this concept or this idea that if I was in that situation, things would have been different because I'm a different person and I would have acted differently. But honestly, you might not have acted very differently. But this is just a mechanism that your brain uses to protect you from this idea. That's what defensive attribution is. Okay, you give reasons for someone else's behavior and blame it on them, rather than thinking about the fact that the situation that Jill was in was probably not as easy as you think. Okay, even if she was wearing normal shoes, she probably wouldn't have been able to get away from a guy who was I think 6'4" or something like that, a pretty stocky build. So he would have easily been able to attack her. Okay, but we don't really consider those situational factors there. Okay, so that's defensive attribution. And defensive attribution is particularly interesting because we tend to make a lot of defensive attributions, particularly with reference to sexual assault victims, even with reference to victims who have been attacked. Okay, that girl from Latrobe, for example, a few years back, who was attacked and killed on her way back from a university lesson. That was just in the evening, like at 7 p.m. That wasn't after midnight, but people might still try to make defensive attributions there and say, oh, she should have been with someone else, or she should have taken a friend rather than go home alone on the tram. Okay, so again, defensive attributions are just there to protect ourselves from the idea that the same thing or the same scary, difficult, traumatic thing might happen to us or could happen to us. Okay, so that's basically defensive attributions. And the last thing that we're looking at for today is self-serving bias. So the self-serving bias is this idea that when we do something good, we take credit for it. But when something bad happens to us, we blame the situation. So a really common example is if you do well in the SAC, you say, I passed the SAC because I worked hard. Or if you get, let's say, a really good mark in the SAC, you might say, oh, you know, all my hard work paid off. But if you don't do well on the SAC, you might be like, oh, you know, we didn't get much time to study, or, you know, the SAC was on EP, or the teacher didn't teach us this topic enough, or we didn't get enough practice material. So you might start to blame the situation rather than yourself. So again, positive behavior, you attribute it to your own personality, effort, or intelligence. So you make an internal attribution, whereas with negative behavior, you make an external attribution. Okay, you blame it on the situation. So negative behavior, you make an external attribution. Positive behavior, you make an internal attribution there. Okay, so that's the basic idea. Now, one explanation for why we are so self-serving and why we have the self-serving bias is to protect our self-esteem. Okay, a lot of the time it's a psychological defense mechanism that we use, that when we don't do so well in something, like if you fail your driving test, for example, you wouldn't really blame it on your lack of practice, because sure, you would have practiced enough. But in order to stop your brain from entertaining the idea that, oh my God, I did 120 hours of driving, but I still failed, you apply the self-serving bias. So you say, okay, I failed the driving test because the weather conditions weren't so good, or because the driving instructor was a mean guy, or because you know, this driving test center in Werribee is more strict compared to others that are in Sunshine or in other suburbs. So you start to blame situational factors rather than take ownership for your own faults there. Okay, so that's basically one reason for the self-serving bias. And the last slide, I promise it's the last slide. The last slide is culture as a personal factor. Okay, so as I said in the beginning of this, beginning of the PowerPoint, depending on the culture that you're from, that can also influence what kind of attribution you make. And a lot of cultures, like Asian cultures, for example, or we call them Eastern cultures or Eastern natures, they're known as collectivist cultures. Okay, they're cultures where there's a lot of focus on the person not being as important as the group. The group is everything in those cultures. Okay. In cultures like Japan, China, and Korea, being too self-confident or being too full of yourself or always saying me is actually looked down upon. Okay. Because there's a huge focus on achieving success as a group, as a community, and as a society, rather than individual progress or individual achievement. Okay. So in these countries, self-confidence is looked down upon. Okay. And for this reason, people from collectivist cultures like Japan, China, Korea, Taiwan, whatever, they are less likely to make internal attributions there. Okay, they're less likely to attribute a behavior to themselves. They're more likely to attribute that behavior to the group or to the society or situation. On the other hand, we're from an individualist culture. Okay, we're from a Western nation. So Western nations like Australia, the UK, or the USA, we tend to focus more on internal attribution. So it's all about me. There's an emphasis on me and my personal success and my personal achievements rather than the group. Okay. In other words, in Australia and these Western nations, it's like every man for himself or every woman for herself kind of thing. Okay. So obviously for this reason, the self-serving bias and fundamental attribution error are more likely to be held compared to collectivist cultures. Okay. There's an example here that you can read. I've noticed the time is already 9:50. So what we're going to do is we're going to end it here. If you have any questions about this spread, just let me know. And the rest of your work for before next class is to just finish off your 7C questions. And also make sure your chapter 6 questions are up to date as well. I'll put a due work to submit that as well by the end of the week. Okay, guys, that's it for today. Bye.